When you reach a certain part of your career, you have to reinvent yourself and you have to pull things out that people never thought that you would do. That bun that he had, was different.
There were men in professional wrestling who actually scared Bill Goldberg. Not the crowd, not the cameras. Real men, standing a few feet away from him, in a business where one wrong move can end a career. On television, he looked unstoppable. Behind the curtain, a small group of wrestlers made him careful in a way the fans at home never saw. That is the strange part of the Goldberg story. WCW built him into a monster. The streak was billed at 173-0. He was 285 pounds of muscle and speed. He walked out through smoke and sparks with security around him, and grown men in the front row believed every second of it. The whole point of the character was simple. Nobody could stop him. But professional wrestling has always been two things at the same time. It is a scripted show, and it is a real physical business. The story is planned. The impact is not fake. Safety depends on cooperation. It depends on trust. It depends on a locker room hierarchy that nobody writes down and everybody follows anyway. Goldberg walked into that world straight out of professional football. He had size. He had explosive power. He had almost no traditional training in ring mechanics. That gap did not matter against most opponents, because most opponents were there to be destroyed in 90 seconds. It mattered enormously against a small group of men who carried real credentials, real reputations, and real physical leverage. So this is not a list of men who could beat Goldberg in a fight. It is a list of 5 different cracks in the Goldberg legend, and the men who stood in each one of them. We start with the man whose reputation had nothing to do with the script. Number 5, Meng. His real name was Uliuli Fifita. In WCW, he was Meng. In the WWF, he was Haku. And in wrestling circles, he holds a status that almost nobody argues about. Ask the men who worked in that era who the toughest wrestler alive was, and the same name keeps coming back. He is widely treated as the most legitimate fighter of his generation. That reputation was not built on television. It was built in bars, in car parks, and in the stories veterans told each other in quiet corners of the locker room. Real bar fights that he won. A tolerance for pain that did not look human. Functional strength that had nothing to do with posing in a gym. Wrestlers spend their whole careers learning how to look tough. Meng never had to learn it. He simply was. The stories that follow him are the kind you assume have been stretched over time. Then you notice that the people telling them are not fans. They are men who were there. Backstage accounts describe him tearing at a man's nose until the tissue came away, pulling teeth out, gouging eyes, snapping a set of police handcuffs with his bare hands. Arn Anderson put it in a way the business has never forgotten. There are tough men in the world. Then there are men who are wrestler tough, which is a different level again. And then, sitting completely on his own, there was Meng. Now put that man in the ring with the biggest new star in the company. WCW booked Goldberg to beat Meng. That was the business. The monster had to keep rolling, and the streak needed bodies. But there is a difference between beating someone on paper and physically handling them in front of a live crowd. Goldberg's finish was the jackhammer. It is not a quick move. It is a delayed vertical suplex that turns into a power slam. You lift a grown man off his feet, hold him upside down in the air, let the blood run to his head, and then drive him down. The whole thing only works if the man in your arms is helping you and trusting you completely. Meng weighed around 300 pounds. So Goldberg had to hoist 300 pounds of the most feared man in wrestling into the air, hold him there, keep him balanced, and land him safely. People watching noticed something in how Goldberg did it. The execution changed. The usual carelessness was gone. Everything about the way he handled Meng was precise. That precision was not an accident, and it was not just professionalism. Think about what a mistake would have cost him. If Goldberg dropped a jobber, he apologized and moved on. If Goldberg dropped Meng, 2 things happened at once. The first was physical. The man on the floor had a documented history of hurting people who upset him, and nobody in that building was going to be able to stop him. The second was professional, and in some ways it was worse. The locker room would have seen it. The word would have spread within the hour. The new star with no wrestling background had just injured the one man everybody respected. That is a career problem, not just a bad night. Here is the detail that explains the whole hierarchy. Meng standing in that locker room had nothing to do with his position on the card. He was not the world champion. He was not the man the company was building around. On paper, he was somewhere in the middle of the roster, and the office could have moved him up or down whenever it wanted. None of that changed how people treated him. That is what a legitimate reputation does in a business like this. Titles are handed out by the company. Respect of that kind is not. The writers could decide who won on Monday night. They could not decide who the other wrestlers were quietly careful around in the corridor, and Meng was at the top of that list for years, regardless of what the storyline said about him. So the man WCW was building its future on had to physically handle the man WCW had no real control over, and do it perfectly, in front of a live crowd, with no second attempt available. You will not see any of that watching the match back. The crowd saw a squash. The finish landed, the streak moved on by one. Everything looked exactly as planned, which is the point. The pressure was invisible, and it was all on the man who was supposed to be fearless. This is where the Goldberg legend starts to come apart in an interesting way. On camera, Goldberg was a man who feared nothing. That was the entire product. He stared through people. He did not sell nerves. His public line was always that no human being on earth frightened him. But watch how he actually worked with Meng. The behavior tells a different story than the interviews do. Every physical decision he made in there was cautious. That is not the same as being afraid. It is something more honest. It is a man recognizing that the person opposite him operated under different rules. And to be fair to Goldberg, he never hid his respect. Looking back on those years, he spoke about Meng with something close to reverence. He called him a mentor. He called him an idol. He talked about how humble the man was once he stepped outside the ring, which is its own kind of compliment, because the people who are genuinely dangerous rarely need to advertise it. So what is the weakness here? It is not strength. Goldberg was enormously strong, and nobody serious disputes that. The weakness is that a television character can be booked to be unstoppable, but a television character cannot cancel out a real reputation. WCW could write Goldberg to beat Meng in under 2 minutes. What WCW could not do was change how Goldberg had to physically handle him to get there. That is the first crack in the invincibility. The streak said Goldberg was untouchable. The way he lifted Meng said something else. Somewhere in his head, he knew exactly who he was holding. Reputation was one kind of pressure. It made Goldberg careful about what might happen if things went wrong. But there was another kind of man out there. Not a legend from bar fight stories. Someone who could stand across the ring and be Goldberg's physical equal in every measurable way, with better credentials on top. Number 4. Brock Lesnar. Understand what made Goldberg special in the first place, and you understand why Lesnar was different from everybody else on the roster. Goldberg's whole appeal was that he did not look like a wrestler. He looked like an athlete who had wandered in from another sport and started hurting people. The football background was real. The size was real. The explosion off the line was real. Most wrestlers had to act big. Goldberg simply was big, and the camera could tell. That worked because there was nobody to compare him to. Put him next to a normal wrestler and the difference was obvious in about 2 seconds. Then Brock Lesnar arrived, and the comparison stopped being flattering. Lesnar was not just another large man. He was an NCAA Division I heavyweight national champion. Later he went to the UFC and won the heavyweight championship there too. Those are not wrestling accomplishments. Those are 2 of the hardest things an athlete can do, in 2 different sports, both of them completely real. Now put the 2 of them side by side. Lesnar matched Goldberg's 285-pound frame. He had superior amateur wrestling control, which means he understood leverage, position, and body weight, in a way you can only learn on a mat over years. He had explosive closing speed, so he could cover distance before you were ready, and he had genuine martial power, meaning he could actually apply all of it to another human being. Everything Goldberg was famous for, Lesnar had. Then Lesnar had more. Sit with how rare that is. Wrestling has always had huge men. It has always had strong men. What it almost never has is a heavyweight who reached the very top of amateur wrestling and then went and won a world title in real fighting as well. Those 2 achievements do not usually live in the same body, because the training that builds one tends to work against the other. Goldberg's credentials were athletic. Football at the professional level is elite, and it is punishing, but it is not combat between 2 individual men. Lesnar's credentials were combat. He had proved, in front of judges and referees and paying customers, that he could take another heavyweight and impose his will on him for real. So the comparison was not just uncomfortable for Goldberg's character. It was the one comparison the character had no answer to. This is the part people miss when they talk about the 2 of them. Every other opponent Goldberg faced had to help sell the idea that Goldberg was the most dangerous man in the building. They took the spear. They flew for it. They made it look devastating. That is the job. Lesnar did not need to help. He could absorb a Goldberg spear the way a wall absorbs a football. And strangely, Goldberg loved that. He said many times that Lesnar was his ideal opponent. He described him as a physical mirror image, and the description fits. Both men came from college football. Both carried heavy muscle. Both worked a loud, high-intensity, power-based style. There was nobody else in wrestling who spoke the same physical language. Working with Lesnar gave Goldberg a rare kind of freedom. With most opponents, he had to hold back. He had to think about the smaller man's neck, or ribs, or landing. With Lesnar, he did not have to think about any of that. He could hit at full speed. He could throw everything he had, because Lesnar had the neck strength, the core mass, and the conditioning to take heavy impact and stand back up without breaking. For a man built entirely around force, that is close to a gift. Then came the moment that made their relationship famous. Goldberg returned to WWE in 2016 and stayed into 2017. He was older. The modern audience had not seen him in his prime. There was a real risk that the return would look like nostalgia rather than danger. The match with Lesnar at Survivor Series 2016 fixed that in a way nobody expected, and the idea did not come from Goldberg. Lesnar personally put the booking together. He proposed that Goldberg beat him in 86 seconds. Not a competitive match. Not a slow build. A demolition, over before the crowd had settled, with the modern era's most protected monster lying flat on his back. Think about what that cost the man agreeing to it. Lesnar was the biggest attraction in the company. He had every reason to protect himself. Instead, he handed his own aura over so that a returning legend could look untouchable again for a new generation. It worked immediately. In under 2 minutes, Goldberg's invincibility was restored for an audience that had only heard about it secondhand. Goldberg has never been quiet about what that meant to him. He expressed deep gratitude for how selfless it was, and he pointed out that Lesnar understood something personal about it. Goldberg wanted his family to see him do this. Lesnar understood that motivation, and he built the match around it. So where is the vulnerability in a story that ends with a favor? It is in what had to be true for that favor to matter. Goldberg kept absolute focus every time he shared the ring with Lesnar. He knew exactly what he was standing across from. He knew that Lesnar had the legitimate physical ability to dominate almost any athlete on the planet if the cooperation between them ever stopped. That is the uncomfortable truth behind the whole Goldberg presentation. His dominance was real, in the sense that his power was real, but it only stayed dominance while the other man agreed to it. With most opponents, that agreement was never in doubt. With Lesnar, Goldberg was fully aware that the agreement was the only thing holding the picture together. That is not fear in the way the word usually gets used. It is respect, with consequences attached. So the second crack is a strange one. Goldberg was not exposed by someone who beat him. He was exposed by the one man who could have made the whole illusion collapse, and simply chose not to. Lesnar was the same size, the same shape, and the same kind of athlete. That made him easy to understand as a threat. The next man was not a threat in any of those ways. He was smaller, he was slower, he did not look dangerous standing next to Goldberg at all, and he did more damage to the Goldberg character in 6 minutes than anyone else on this list. Number 3. William Regal. The date was the 9th of February, 1998. The show was WCW Monday Nitro. The building was in El Paso, Texas, and the man across from Goldberg was Lord Steven Regal, later known to the world as William Regal. Regal came from British catch-as-catch-can wrestling. That phrase gets thrown around loosely, so it is worth explaining what it actually means. Catch wrestling is a real fighting style. Regal was trained in legitimate submission hooks, in joint locks, and in positional control. He knew how to attach himself to another man's body, take away his balance, and make him wrestle at a pace he did not choose. It is quiet, technical, and extremely effective, and it looks like almost nothing to a casual viewer. Now think about what Goldberg was at that point. Goldberg matches were usually over in under 2 minutes. That was the formula, and it was working beautifully. He came out, he speared someone, he jackhammered them, and the crowd went home happy. The short length was not laziness. It was protection. A man with minimal ring training does not need to be exposed for 12 minutes. He needs to be terrifying for 90 seconds and then leave. This match was scheduled for 6 minutes. 6 minutes does not sound like much. For Goldberg in early 1998, 6 minutes was an eternity. It was 3 times longer than his usual work, against the one style he had no answer for. And this was not a house show in a small building. This was Nitro, live, in front of a national television audience. At the exact moment WCW was pushing Goldberg harder than anyone in the company. There is one more thing worth understanding about the styles involved, because it explains everything that followed. Goldberg's style needed movement. He needed a running start, an opponent coming towards him, and space to explode into. Every part of his offense began with forward momentum. Catch wrestling takes all of that away. It works close, it works slow, and it works by controlling limbs and hips, rather than by trading big collisions. It is the exact opposite of what Goldberg had been trained to do, and the very worst possible matchup for a man whose only real weapon was a violent first 3 seconds. And it did not stay a normal wrestling match. It deteriorated into something stiff and competitive. Regal did exactly what a catch wrestler does. He blocked Goldberg's aggressive rushes, which took away the single most important thing in Goldberg's arsenal. The whole character was based on charging forward and running someone over. Regal simply stopped that from happening. He applied real wrist locks, not the loose cooperative version, but proper ones. And at one point, with Goldberg down on all fours, Regal was delivering stiff toe kicks to him. Picture that scene properly, because this is the moment the whole video is built around. This is the man WCW was selling as the most destructive force in the industry, on his hands and knees, being kicked by a smaller technical wrestler, unable to get going. The crowd could see it. The people watching at home could see it. Most importantly, the executives backstage could see it. Goldberg looked uncoordinated. He could not impose his physical dominance. For a few minutes, the veil over his rapid corporate push was lifted, and what the audience saw underneath was a very strong man who did not yet know how to wrestle. That is the difference between this section and every other one on this list. Meng made Goldberg careful. Lesnar made Goldberg focused. Regal made Goldberg look ordinary, live, on national television. The aftermath created real heat between the two men, and the two versions of that night have never fully lined up. Goldberg's view was that he had been sabotaged. He saw himself as an inexperienced performer who had been taken advantage of on live national television by a veteran. The match had turned into something highly physical without ever being communicated to him, and he had not agreed to it. His position was straightforward. If Regal wanted a stiff, competitive fight, that was fine, but it should have been discussed beforehand, so he could have responded properly. Nobody warned him. He was put out there expecting one kind of match and given another. Regal's view was completely different, and he never changed it. He said he was following explicit instructions from the producers. The direction he was given was to deliver a competitive, drawn-out match that would test Goldberg's endurance. He did what he was told to do. If the result made the company's new star look bad, that was not a plot. That was the assignment. Both of those accounts have been repeated for years. Neither one has ever been settled beyond what the men themselves said, and it is worth leaving them both standing rather than pretending we know which one is true. What we do know is what happened backstage afterwards. Eric Bischoff came looking for Regal, and he was furious. This was the biggest star in the company, being made to look clumsy in a live television main event slot. Regal's answer to him has become one of the most quoted lines in the history of that era. "I can't hit myself, Eric." That one sentence explains the entire philosophical divide. Regal's point was simple. A wrestling match is a two-way conversation. One man cannot carry it alone. If Goldberg was waiting to be led through it, waiting for the other man to feed him spots and set everything up, then the emptiness in the middle of the match was not Regal's doing. Goldberg needed to initiate his own offense. He needed to take the match somewhere. Standing there waiting for the veteran to hand him a performance is not wrestling. You can hear both sides in that. Regal was pointing out a genuine hole in Goldberg's training. Goldberg was pointing out that a veteran had a duty to protect a less experienced man rather than expose him in front of millions of people. Both of those things can be true at the same time, and that is probably why the argument has lasted so long. A man with 2 years of experience should not have been sent out for 6 competitive minutes against a British catch wrestler with no warning. Also, a man being pushed as the future of the company should have been able to take charge of a match without being led by the hand. The reason this section matters more than the others is that nothing here was hidden. Meng's danger lived in stories. Lesnar's danger lived in what might have happened. Regal's happened on camera, in real time, where anybody could watch it and draw their own conclusions. The argument is interesting. The lesson underneath it is more important. For all the sparks and the security guards and the undefeated streak, Goldberg's dominance was a structure. It relied on the other man playing his role. It relied on short matches. It relied on nobody testing the foundation. Regal tested the foundation, and the whole thing wobbled. This was a serious lesson for Goldberg and for WCW management. An accomplished catch wrestler could systematically disarm an untrained powerhouse the moment the scripted structure fractured. Not by cheating, not by attacking him, simply by refusing to make it easy, and by knowing a style that raw strength has no natural answer to. Goldberg's greatest weapon was overwhelming force applied quickly. Regal showed what happened when that force was dragged into a technical fight it was never built for. Regal's danger came from skill. He did not need to be bigger, and he never had to threaten anyone to make his point. The next man did not need skill or threats either. His authority arrived before the bell, and it came from a place Goldberg understood better than anyone. Number 2, Ron Simmons. Before wrestling, Ron Simmons was a serious football player, not a decent college athlete. A consensus All-American defensive tackle at Florida State University, and later an inductee into the College Football Hall of Fame. That is the highest level of recognition the college game gives out. Then he came to wrestling and made history again, becoming the first African-American WCW World Heavyweight Champion. So he arrived in that locker room with two things most men never get: genuine athletic credibility and a place in the record books. But that is not what made him someone Goldberg approached carefully. Plenty of wrestlers have impressive backgrounds. Simmons had something else on top. He had a reputation in the locker room that commanded immense respect. Explosive core power, the kind that comes from years of firing off a defensive line. Deceptively heavy hands, which is a phrase wrestlers use carefully because it means the strikes are not for show, and a zero-tolerance policy for unprofessionalism. That last part matters most. To understand why, you have to understand how a wrestling locker room actually worked in that era. There was no formal system. There was an unwritten code, and it was rooted in physical toughness, mutual respect, and deference to seniority. You earned your place. You did not walk in and act like you owned it. Younger talents were expected to work safely, listen, and show respect to the men who had been there longer. Simmons was widely known as a veteran who would not tolerate any of the things that broke that code: disrespect, reckless ring work, ego-driven behavior from someone who had not earned it yet. Now look at Goldberg's position in 1998, honestly. He was the newcomer. He had been in the business for a very short time. He had risen faster than almost anyone in wrestling history, and he had been handed a level of protection that veterans had spent decades chasing. Men who had bled in that company for 15 years were watching a former football player go straight past them because the crowd liked his entrance. That situation creates resentment in any workplace. In a workplace where everyone is physically dangerous, it creates something more serious. There is one more layer to this, and it is the interesting part. Goldberg was a former Atlanta Falcons defensive tackle. Simmons was a Florida State defensive tackle. Same sport, same position, same world. That is a bond. Elite football alumni in wrestling recognized each other instantly, and they operated inside a shared cultural framework. They spoke the same language, and had been through the same brutal grind. But that bond cuts both ways. A shared language of toughness means you cannot bluff. Goldberg's whole presentation was built on physical intimidation, and that presentation does not work on a man who played the same position at the same level and has spent his entire adult life around men that size. Whatever aura the cameras created, Simmons was not going to be impressed by it. There is something else in that shared background that people outside sport tend to miss. Football at that level teaches you a very specific set of manners. You respect the older players. You do not tell people how good you are, because everybody around you was the best player in their town too. You earn your standing through work, and you accept correction from the men who came before you. Simmons carried that code into wrestling and expected it to be followed. Goldberg had been raised inside the same code, so he knew exactly what was expected of him, and exactly what happened to people who ignored it. That is why this relationship never turned into a story about conflict. The two men understood each other. One of them simply had seniority, and the other one had the sense to acknowledge it. So Goldberg approached him with explicit caution and professional humility. That is exactly the right way to describe it, and it is worth being precise here. This was not fear. There is no suggestion anywhere that Simmons was looking for a confrontation, or that anything ever happened between them. It is simpler than that. Goldberg understood that Simmons had two forms of leverage. He had the physical ability to correct an opponent who got too aggressive during a match, which is a real thing that used to happen and was rarely discussed openly. And he had backstage authority, meaning his opinion of you traveled around the company and shaped how everyone else treated you. Against that combination, being the most protected act on television means nothing at all. So the fourth crack in the legend is not about a move or a punch or a submission hold. It is about a hierarchy the character could not overwrite. The Goldberg presentation said he answered to nobody. The reality was that he was a new man in an old business, and there were veterans in that building whose respect he needed to earn before a bell ever rang. Learning that is not weakness. It is survival. But it does sit awkwardly beside a character who was sold as answering to no one. Reputation, parody, technique, and authority all made Goldberg adjust in different ways. In each case, the danger was mostly about what could happen if something went wrong. The last category is different. With these two men, nothing had to go wrong. The pain was guaranteed, and it arrived every single time. Number 1. Big Van Vader and Scott Steiner. These two belong together because they represent the same problem in two forms. Working with them was not a risk to manage. It was punishment to absorb. Start with Vader. His real name was Leon White. He weighed over 450 pounds, and he built an international reputation on an ultra-stiff working style. That phrase deserves explaining, because it is the heart of this whole section. Stiff means the contact is real. The strikes actually land. The impact is not softened for the camera. Now combine that with the weight. Vader was not a soft, heavy man. He was dense. He moved that mass with real force, and when it arrived somewhere on your body, there was nothing you could do about it. The record of what happened to the men who worked with him tells the story. Facial fractures, broken bones, teeth knocked out. Not once, but often enough to become part of what he was known for. Compare that to Meng, and you can see two completely different kinds of danger. Meng was frightening because of who he was and what he might do. His threat lived outside the match. It was about reputation, about respect, and about what would happen if you disrespected him. In an actual match, Meng was a professional. Vader was different. Vader hurt you inside the match, as part of the match, with nobody doing anything wrong. There was no bad blood required. There was no rule broken. That was simply the price of standing in the ring with him. For Goldberg, that meant a change of mindset. His whole natural instinct as a former football player was to protect himself, to brace, to posture, to stay ready. Against Vader, that instinct was useless. Facing him required abandoning self-protection posturing and taking severe physical punishment as part of the job. And the punishment came with a warning attached. Any hesitation, any moment of poor positioning, and the damage stopped being punishment and became a genuine injury. You could not flinch away from 450 pounds. Flinching is what got people hurt. You had to stay exactly where you were supposed to be and take it properly. There is a phrase wrestlers use for this: taking your medicine. It means accepting that some of the damage is not negotiable, that you cannot flinch away from it, and that your body has to be somewhere unpleasant for the picture to work. Most performers of Goldberg's size never had to learn that lesson, because most performers of Goldberg's size were the ones handing out the punishment. Vader was one of the few men in the world who could reverse that arrangement without even trying. Think about what that does to the Goldberg character. Goldberg was sold as the man who delivered pain. That was the entire pitch. The spear, the jackhammer, the crowd counting the seconds. Against Vader, his job included receiving it, in full, with no way to soften the landing. Then there is Scott Steiner, who brought a second kind of heavyweight danger, and it came from somewhere completely different. Steiner had an elite collegiate amateur wrestling background at the University of Michigan. That is legitimate mat credentials at a very high level. So like Lesnar, he knew leverage and control in a way most performers never learned. But he did not combine it with careful, technical restraint. He combined it with explosive physical execution. He was known for high-angle overhead suplexes. Consider what that actually means. He would take a fully grown heavyweight, lift him from a standing position, and throw him backwards over his own head at a steep angle. The man being thrown has no control over the flight, and no ability to protect his own landing. He is completely dependent on the thrower's judgment. That is the part that separates Steiner from every other big man on this list. A suplex like that is not something you can protect yourself from once it starts. You are already in the air. Your feet are already gone. Whatever happens to your neck and your shoulders when you land is decided by somebody else, and there is nothing you can do about it while it is happening. Trust is not a nice idea in that moment. It is the only thing keeping you healthy. Now put that alongside Goldberg's own size. He was 285 pounds. Lifting and throwing a man that heavy at a steep angle is difficult, even when everything goes to plan, because the weight arrives fast and the landing area is small. There is no soft version of that move, and Steiner was known for reckless strength, not measured strength. Not controlled strength, reckless. In WCW, he was formidable and unpredictable, which is an exciting quality in a rival and a genuinely dangerous quality in a work partner. Their feud gave us one match that captures all of it. A no disqualification match at Fall Brawl 2000. No disqualification removes the rules. And with a man like Steiner, removing the rules removes the last bit of structure protecting everyone involved. In a normal match, the rules are also a kind of guardrail. They keep the action inside a shape both men understand. Take them away, and everything becomes improvised, which is exciting for the crowd and considerably more dangerous for the two people involved. Goldberg had to absorb intense physical punishment that night. Heavy steel pipe shots, stiff power moves, not the theatrical version of those things, the real version. And this is where the margin disappears entirely. Encounters with Steiner carried zero margin for error. One botched spot, one uncooperative motion, 1 second where the timing between two enormous men slipped, and the risk was not a bruise. The risk was severe concussion, or structural trauma capable of changing a career permanently. That is the peak of the physical danger in this whole story, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Everything else we have talked about was conditional. Meng was dangerous if you crossed him. Lesnar was dangerous if cooperation broke down. Regal was dangerous if the structure of the match fell apart. Simmons had authority if you disrespected it. Vader and Steiner were dangerous by default. They did not have to be angry. They did not have to be testing anyone. They just had to do their normal work at their normal intensity, and the man opposite had to survive it. So the last crack is the most physical one. The most durable man in wrestling still had to spend certain nights simply enduring, because there were men whose ordinary style would break people who were not ready for it. And the crowd never knew the difference. A Goldberg match against a smaller opponent and a Goldberg match against a 450-pound heavyweight looked like the same product on television. The entrance was the same, the music was the same, the confidence was the same. Only the man in the ring knew which nights were going to hurt in the morning, and those nights were part of the job description that nobody advertised. Goldberg walked into professional wrestling with almost no traditional ring training, at the highest level of the business, during one of the most volatile eras it has ever had. He was surrounded by men with decades of experience, real fighting backgrounds, and every reason to resent how fast he had risen. He came out the other side with a legendary career and his health mostly intact. That does not happen by accident, and it certainly does not happen through arrogance. His longevity depended on recognizing the exact dynamics we have talked about. He balanced the explosive character on screen with genuine respect for the legitimate combat skills, athletic backgrounds, and physical boundaries of the people he worked with. He knew when to be a monster and when to be a professional, and knowing the difference kept him upright. Think about how easily it could have gone the other way. A man with his size, his push, and his ego could have walked into that locker room and decided that the crowd reaction made him untouchable. Plenty of people have made that mistake with far less protection than he had. In that era, with those men, that mistake would have cost him his health, his standing, or both. He did not make it. Whatever else you want to say about him, he read the room correctly, and he kept reading it for years. So the aura was not meaningless. It was just incomplete. The invincible version of Goldberg never existed, because that version cannot exist in a real physical business. What did exist was a man who understood something quieter. In wrestling, being the toughest guy in the room is worth much less than knowing who else is in the room. That is the story WCW never told you, and it is a better one than the one they sold. The real one is harder and far more human than that. The legend gets more interesting once you can see what was standing behind it. Now I want to know what you think. Out of Meng, Brock Lesnar, William Regal, Ron Simmons, and the pair of Vader and Scott Steiner, which one had the strongest claim to Goldberg's respect? Tell me in the comments. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like and subscribe for more wrestling stories.